I'll try and be as fast as possible. My own inspiration about the health of regional economies has led me to study regional integration at a PhD level. What I try to do in this presentation is to try and give us an idea about how our understanding of the history of trade integration will inform our current contemporary understanding of African integration in the larger picture. We simply attempt to go beyond the official statistics and argue that our understanding of historical extent of trade is much more bigger than we previously imagined. So as a proposer, I suggest that we go through a small introduction, a bit of framework for the data itself, some interpretation of the statistics we have done, our impression of the type of integration we are seeing, and the factors that we observe as facilitate that trade integration. And then we'll come forward to post-war era and see how that informs our understanding of the evolution of integration in West Africa at the time, in Africa at the time. We'll conclude with some summaries. Generally, it seems to us that much of the understanding of African history, African economy, is taken from colonial history and how it is intercontinental oriented. So whether West Africa is doing well or not is much measured by how extensively it trades with the West and everybody else. What we find is that there's very limited discussion of the extent of internal trade, which we would call intra-regional trade or regional integration for want of a better word. However, to our view, there's favorable grounds to expect and suspect that local trade would evolve much faster on the basis that we know that there had been an extensive expansion of intercontinental trade from Africa, at least from the colonial era up to now. It still remains the mainstay of most of the economies in Africa at this time. We also know that even in pre-colonial era, there existed a certain structure of internal trade. So the question will remain, what happened to those types of trading and how it evolved over time? In recent times also, it's been well articulated about the relevance of understanding the past and how it informs the current contemporary issues we are being faced with. And therefore, we thought it wise to go back as far as the age of the emergence of globalization, economic globalization, to be able to understand how this evolution of internal trade shows up. We indicate that much of our data is taken from the 4 territories which were under the British influence in West Africa at the time. So the statistics are based on the records from the British sphere of influence. What we do, at least from that statistics we obtain, is to characterize the statistics. We argue that we have what we call hard statistics which tended to be largely comprehensive, which covered mostly foreign trade statistics. By foreign trade, we refer to trade that crossed boundaries, whether intercontinental or within the region. So any trade that crossed territory is foreign trade. However, studying the statistics, one finds substantial record of much trade which were recorded but without values. And unfortunately, we do not have prices to convert them. We term all those types of statistics as soft statistics. And then reading the records as available indicates to us that much more of trade must have gone on which were unrecorded. And largely was because it was not part of the interest of the recorders at the time, which is European colonialists. And therefore, our contention is that the real amount of internal regional trade in West Africa must have been higher than official statistics would reveal to us. The tabulation of our statistics suggests to us that we have this pattern of decline, rise, and decline. The interpretation we place is that in the last 20 years of the 19th century, there was a substantial decline up to almost 1900. That decline is a result of the contestations between the French and the English in terms of territory and in terms of tariffs. There was tariff differentials and territorial contestations. We also observed that there's a huge surge in the first 20 years of the 20th century. What that tells us is that with the extension of British influence in its territories, data capture tended to be much better, and therefore it became much more helpful in being able to surge up the extent of trade. What is curious is that in the post-1920 era, there's a drastic decline. We interpret that decline, based on the statistics we have, as a reflection of the absence of trade statistics and not the absence of trade. And that's the interpretation we place. Based on that understanding, we have then proposed a framework to understand how that extent of trade is estimated. Based on hardcore data recorded in official statistics, we have an estimated trade of almost 13%. But we highlight that we indicated to you what we call soft statistics. We have not added that to it. We have also not added uncaptured statistics, which we also know existed in the colonial records. Our point is simply that if you combine hard statistics, soft statistics, and uncaptured statistics, we may be much more closer to the real extent of trade. That gives us an insight into the real extent of trade integration at the time of colonial era. Sorry. We've mentioned soft statistics, just an insight. This is just an idea of what you call soft statistics. In one territory in present-day Ghana, you have, over this period, this type of commodities were on record as having traded. We indicate that these are basically volumes. They are simply volumes and not valued, and therefore you're unable to add it to any type of trade statistics you have. If you added this type of statistics, our argument is that from the 1920 era, in this area, the graph will begin to shift up again. We've mentioned uncaptured trade statistics. It's an idea of what the colonialists would have recorded consistently in colonial records. We present this just as an insight. Our argument is basically the fact that consistently this kind of records were made, and the manner in which they were described, you see considerable, large number, and how root changes would emerge, suggests to us that there must have been substantial amount of trade that actually existed, which were not uncaptured because partly it wasn't part of colonialist, the trade recorders at the time's focus. Based on what we are suggesting, we present to you what we call an impression of what could have happened in terms of internal trade integration, the extent of trade in West Africa at the time. The black line is just the original graph you saw, a rise and a fall. Our point is that if you added, we call that impression A. Our point is that this peak period will shift to 1924 on the basis that soft statistics, which is mainly from railway carriage, railway records, would shift it to almost 1924. From 1924, one finds that land motor transport had become the most predominant means of transport, and therefore much more trade in that kind of modes of transportation will not be recorded. Our contention is that addition of that type of uncaptured trade, which is much more substantial in our understanding, would shift the graph's frontier from here and sustain it probably much more longer in the rising trends. That's the kind of contention we make. We observe a certain type of structure of the internal integration we are finding. Basically, for the want of time, I'll clarify. The argument is that it's commodity-driven, it's ecologically conditioned, and it's transport motivated under the influence of the intercontinental trade. The main commodities tended to be cola, cocoa, and livestock from the northern hemisphere, which came vertically down. Cola came vertically up and down, sometimes through the coastal regions. Cocoa, which remains predominantly an intercontinental commodity, also influenced the type of integration you find in West Africa in the 60 years before the Second World War. Just a clarification that our contention is basically that the production and the expansion in production of all of these commodities and their consumption were the basis for which this expansion of trade occurs. The next 4 slides is an attempt just to assure you of the estimations we have done. We've just tried to mirror what we know about merchant networks, transportation system, tariffs, and taxation, and then currency, to make an argument that all of that reinforces our view that the extent of internal trade would have been much higher than official records would emerge. For want of time, I would want to skip that and proceed further. So this is for currencies. And then an impression based on all the combination is that whilst one finds the graph goes down, as we have explained in the previous one, it tended to be that transport and tariffs tended to territorialize trade, which led to a decline in interterritorial trade in the region at the time. Again, one finds that land-based transportation tended to sustain the expansion of intra-territorial, that is long-distance trade within colonies, and that's the kind of trade we add as domestic trade. We believe that ecological commonalities and diversities underpinned all this type of intercontinental and intra-regional trade in the region at the time. But then we ask the question, how does that inform our current understanding of internal trade in the region at the time, at this time? The record suggests was that neither internal trade or neither intercontinental trade or intra-regional trade has increased substantially. One finds that in the next slide you will see that sub-Saharan trade to the global share has declined. Even when regional trade agreements have increased, there seems to have been a limited increase in intra-regional trade in the sub-Saharan African region. One observes that trade within the African RTAs average around 8 to 9% between 1995 and 2012. In recent times, just this year, the African Union, through its foreign trade ministers, has come up with what they will call the African Continental Free Trade Area. One could expect and hope that the pursuit of such an agreement may further add impetus to the integration we would observe. Here is what we've post-war sub-Saharan African trade. One finds, as mentioned, a decline from 1950. It declines up and begins to rise again up until 2015, per the World Bank and the IMF records. The share of global trade for sub-Saharan African countries have tended to decline or virtually been constant in the post-war era. But the explanation for what we find in that graph is basically the fact that there's been low levels of industrialization, and the post-war implementation of import substitution policies tended to have failed in the colonies at the time, in the countries at the time. Again, we know that there's a fundamental problem with the development, maintenance, and connectivity of critical infrastructure for trade integration. We understand that railways, roads, and electricity and communication are of low quality from many studies, both from policy and economic circles. The landlord nature of West African economies has a way of affecting how trade will evolve, given that this type of connectivity routes don't exist much more. Again, there is a certain high uncertainty of trading costs and time delays, again, based on transportation and based on technology. In the post-war era, much more of interstate conflict have tended to impede the extent of integration one would have expected. But here is a comparison that gives an insight into what could have happened or what can happen if one pursues internal trade or internal trade integration. Asia becomes the best comparator, at least in the post-war era. One finds that in the Asian context, while the extent of intra-Asian trade tends to increase, and is increased in the post-war era from 1950 to almost 1915 there around. It's almost 3 times the value from the post-war era. Again, it's a similar pattern, though it's a bit more shift for the extent of trade to the global sphere of global trade. What that means for us and for me is the fact that if African economies want to have that kind of economic growth they would need, which we all aspire for, one has to necessarily pursue the type of regional level trade and integration activities that has a very good potential of building up economic capacity for development. The conclusion we draw in summary is that if we adapt a different framework for understanding the evolution and dynamics of trade in most regions without data, one can have a better understanding of the extent of trade, which will inform the extent of integration one expects. Again, we observe in our study that indigenous responses were much more of the main value, which tended to spur on and sustain trade responses at a regional level. We know from our study that a network of regional trade routes offered a degree of economic unity, which partially integrated the ecological, geographic, cultural, and political spheres of West Africa. The implication for current policymakers is the fact that we seem to be locked in on the colonial trade accounting orientation. We tended to be viewing trade from from Africa in general, in most places, as trade that cross boundaries and mostly intercontinental trade overseas, and therefore have very much limited understanding of what currently is being discussed as informal trade and how that affects the size and strength of the economies as we have now. Furthermore, one has to question how the interplay of our understanding of the extent of trade at the time post-war, or at least post-colonial era, has affected our efforts towards regional integration. If our assessment of the economy at the initial stage is faulted by our conception of the extent and the size of the economy, one is bound to be on the wrong route, given that we have a wrong assessment of the economy, given its initial conditions. Again, we have a predicted sense that Africa in general is going to enjoy what they call a demographic dividend. Some have argued that that dividend is much more useful in terms of market and therefore can spur off regional integration. But the question remains whether that will be enough to guarantee the extent of integration that Africa would necessarily want. My contention is that that will be necessary but not sufficient. One needs to have much more improvement in transportation or address all the geographical constraints that exist. Again, we must continue to build indigenous responses. We must continue to capacitate indigenes to be responsive to the innovations that will emerge in the coming era. We must also be aware of the external and global economic policy environment and how we can take much more fair trade rather than free trade. Fair trade is what the argument should be about and not free trade. And then the good old notions of savings and accumulations, investment in both human and hard capital would be much more helpful if the sub-Saharan African regions would be able to integrate and enjoy the benefit of regional integration at that level. Thank you.